Matthew Ray is very good at gaslighting. So what Matthew Ray will do is, let's say we just don't fund a hospital compared to inflation. Like we cut funding to a certain program in a hospital and we don't fund it for 3 years. And then the year before the election, they gave it $40 million to that exact location and that exact program, right? And then he will say, we've added $40 million in new funding.
Okay.
It doesn't look at the $300 million that was taken away. He only mentions the $40 million that's new. But it's not new. It's most of the time just starting to fund a program you haven't funded in years that you used to do.
I'm Colin Burrows, and this is the Wood-stein Media Podcast, Season 2, Episode 3. This podcast is produced on the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, Anishinaabe, and Odawa peoples. On this podcast, I chat with Jason Davis, the NDP candidate for Perth-Wellington in the 2025 Ontario election. This has been a snap election, and it will be over by the end of February 27th. So, Ontario, if you want to get out and vote, get out now. You can find out where to vote at elections.on.ca. We chatted about healthcare, education, harm reduction, and transportation, and he laid out plans for a responsible Ontario government that would lift the weight that our current government has downloaded to municipalities and bring it back up to the government in Queen's Park. He talks about his passion for developing effective, affordable housing options and his dedication to saving lives through maintaining, not cutting, harm reduction options across the province. Davis also spoke of NDP plans to help combat food insecurity that would encourage using locally harvested produce and options to help make food costs more affordable in grocery stores. Like I said, this is a snap election. It might be over before some people know what's happening. For where and when to vote, visit elections.on.ca. Election day is February 27th. This podcast and Wood-stein Media are independently produced journalism. You can support them through Patreon or by donating through PayPal at Wood-stein.ca. That's WOOD-STEIN.ca. Thanks for your interest and support. If you enjoy this podcast, you can support it by listening to more episodes and liking, sharing, subscribing, and reviewing them. This is very helpful and appreciated. How I'm doing this podcast is I'm a Perth-Wellington resident, so I'm a constituent. I'm going to ask you about some of the things I'm concerned with and just treat it like I'm someone you're trying to win over for the vote, because that's exactly who I am. So,
Sounds good.
All right. So that's out of the way. I'm going to jump right into healthcare, how it's been going, hospital closures. What is the NDP, or you if you get in, what is your mandate on that? What are you going to try to do to make sure we don't have that happening?
Yeah, so there's a few things we need to do. Number one is fund healthcare properly. Like if you look at in 2022 alone, we underfunded healthcare in Ontario by $12.3 billion compared to provincial averages. So we need to just fund it correctly right off the bat. We also want to increase the number of residency spots and recruit more doctors as well, a total of 3,500 over 4 years. We'd also like to hire 15,000 nurses. I know that seems like a large number, but a lot of the nurses we have right now are actually basically being contracted from for-profit private nursing agencies. So that's actually costing us hundreds of millions of dollars a year, because after Ford brought in Bill 124 and those other legislations that basically try to take humans out of nursing, they all quit. And then we had to hire them back through these agencies because those agencies won't limit their wages and stuff like that. And so now we're spending hundreds of millions extra on that. And instead, we'd like to end that reliance on those for-profit agencies, instead just hire the nurses ourselves. Another thing we're looking to do is create a path to practice for the 13,000 internationally trained doctors currently in Ontario that are unable to practice here. Like, we have doctors driving taxis right now. It's nuts. So we need to get a path to practice for them and get them into the system as well. Other than that, we'd also like to ratio the number of nurses to patient. So right now, we're ending up having some nurses that are dealing with way more patients than they possibly can in an emergency room. And that's causing them to have burnout and just not be able to get the quality of care that they need. So hopefully between all of those things, we can really start to pad the staff shortages in the healthcare system. And then outside of that, funding it correctly is just the best thing to do, right? Like, it was the Liberals in 2017 that first allowed private clinics and hospitals in Ontario for the first time in 44 years. And then since they opened that door, Doug Ford has ran with it. One hospital, was the Don Mills Surgical Clinic, which has ties directly to his own administration. Their funding was increased by 287%, while the rest of it the rest of the hospitals in Ontario haven't even kept with inflation. The public ones were being underfunded compared to inflation until the end of last year. And the private ones, like, if you look at, like, yes, Matthew Ray will say, hey, OHIP's paying for these surgeries in these private clinics. Yes, OHIP's paying for it. It's paying double. It's right around double the price for every single surgery, basically, cataracts, everything in these private clinics. So it's just draining the public funding in healthcare into the private system and away from the public. And so getting rid of a lot of that private care, getting rid of some of those private clinics, switching back into the public system and rehiring our staff back so we're not relying on the agencies is going to go a long way to making the dollars that are already in the system more efficient, and then making sure we're actually giving the right amount of dollars on top of making efficiencies.
There's a couple things you said in there. Number one, you were saying that over $12 billion we're short compared to other provinces. And so I always see, when I'm looking at my local paper or whatever, I'll see like a press release from Matthew Ray saying great things about the funding. They funded something to do with healthcare. It won't be a $12 billion project. So are they right now just doing small things and celebrating small things like they're big things?
Matthew Ray is very good at gaslighting. So what Matthew Ray will do is, let's say we just don't fund a hospital compared to inflation. Like, we cut funding to a certain program in a hospital and we don't fund it for 3 years. And then the year before the election, they gave it $40 million to that exact location and that exact program, right? And then he will say, we've added $40 million in new funding.
Okay.
It doesn't look at the 300 million that was taken away. He only mentions the 40 million that's new. But it's not new. It's most of the time just starting to fund a program you haven't funded in years that you used to do.
I think this has to do with healthcare too. I used to write for the Listowel Banner. So I did a series of articles and got pretty deep into our unhoused population here in Listowel. And in that, I got to know a lot of people, a lot of good people who were having hard times. And some of them happened to be substance users. Many of them have passed due to drug poisonings. And I'm seeing this government cut important harm reduction techniques and stuff, the closures of the safe injection sites and that. So, yeah. So what is the NDP plan to help that vulnerable population?
Sure. So there's a couple things for that. Number one, right off the bat, is mental health is going to be a part of universal healthcare. It should have always been, I don't know why we have this weird thing where certain parts of your body are just considered not part of healthcare, and then other, like dental, for example, you ignore root canal for long enough, it becomes a $50,000 heart condition. So maybe we should just do the $1,000 tooth first, right? So mental health, we want that to be part of the universal care system, and that's not even new to this year's policy. That was last election as well, and we're just going to keep fighting on that one until it's done. And actually, I have a lot of personal experience with this area. Like my wife studies mental health and addiction at University of Waterloo. She's going for her PhD in it.
Okay.
Just finishing up her undergrad, where she's majoring in biology and psychology. But she also volunteers with some of the consumption treatment services that are in Kitchener, and I've gone out with them to speak at like the Kitchener City Council meetings and Waterloo regional meetings and all that, where they're trying to fight to keep these services running.
Mm-hmm.
I yelled at Matthew Ray about this because he had the audacity to show up to Overdose Awareness Week and speak at the event the same week that they decided they were going to gut all the consumption treatment services.
Okay, yeah.
And as of next month, I believe it is, all the funding for any consumption treatment service is gone. Anyone that was previously providing these kind of services, if they wish to maintain funding from the province, they have to sign on as a heart hub. And heart hubs are abstinence-only programs. They will offer you rehab, and they will offer you nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
In that case, we're no longer even going to be doing needle exchanges.
Yeah, I saw that. That's going back to pre-1980s.
It's like, why do we want another AIDS outbreak? Like, I don't understand whose team you're on with that. Needles are not very expensive. Treating AIDS is very expensive. Treating Hep C is very expensive. It saves them so much money to just offer needle exchanges, let alone how much money it costs when someone dies of an overdose, right? Like, there was a study done recently. I could send you a link to it. I'll ask my wife for it because, like I said, this is her specialty. But it was something around $175 billion is the total cost to our economy of loss of life due to drug. Right? Like that's talking about the economic cost of those people not being able to be in the labor force. That's talking about the amount that their families would have been willing to put into the economy to keep them alive. It was around the tune of, I believe it was $175 billion. Crazy.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously we'd be canceling the hard hubs and we going back to funding consumption treatment services because they are proven to work. You cannot get better if you're dead. And then universal mental health care is vitally needed.
And education, and once again, this includes mental health. Mental health is everywhere. Education, there's a lot of problems there's underfunding to schools themselves, like structurally in some cases. There's underfunding to, like, classroom sizes are too big now, and there's not enough support for not enough EAs available a lot of the time. They're taking on too much pressure. Teachers are taking on too much pressure. So what are you going to do to improve our school system?
Sure. So we have 3 different school systems that are currently in dire health. Starting with childcare, right? Like in Perth, it's a 4-year wait list to get into the public childcare system. And by that point, you're in school. So it literally could not be longer. Like the day my son was born, I signed him up for childcare because you needed a date of birth. And then in September, he starts school. He's still on the wait list.
Wow.
He's 4 in June. He's still on the wait list. And then on top of that, we haven't had licensed at-home childcare in Perth-Wellington since November of 2022. Perth Care for Kids stopped doing the licensing at the same time as the date to register for the $10 a day program ended. So no one was able to sign up for the $10 a day program. Every single spot that was licensed had to take one less kid because once they lost their licenses, they had one less placement. And so we lost about 30 placements and made it so that hundreds of families could not access the $10 a day program. And now we have a complete collapse in the system. I'm not saying that we don't have good at-home unlicensed care. Of course we do. My son's in one that's very safe now. but there was one before where he came home with bruises and we had to take him out. I've talked to other parents that had to pick up their kid from an unlicensed facility and rush them to the hospital because the kid fell down the stairs, right? So it's become such a dangerous situation now that we should be fixing it now before we say we could have saved this one child and that child becomes the face of the movement. We don't need a toddler to be a martyr for this program to be given attention to. And then for elementary schools, the way we're funding them is wrong right off the bat. We should be funding schools based on student needs, not based on number of children. So that's how you're ending up with these massively overcrowded schools, is because they get more dollars based on the number of heads. And not all children have the same needs, right? Like my mom was an education assistant and she worked with kids that have special needs and also Down syndrome and nonverbal autism and stuff like that. And they require a lot more assistance than, let's say, your honor students, right? And to fund them all equally is just not working. The NDP is committed to funding based on student needs. And then we're also looking at investing $830 million a year for 10 years to repair the damages to our school and make sure that we keep up with them so that we don't have more schools falling into disarray. That sounds like a lot, $830 million a year for 10 years, but that's less than what we were going to spend on the Highway 413. So it's really not that much. And then the other thing we want to do now is we want to do a school lunch program, because right now there's a huge problem with a lack of food security. Like Kingston, for example, just declared a state of emergency because 1 in 3 families are struggling with food security. So we want to make sure that all kids have access to healthy, whole foods, and we're going to do that with the school lunch program for every kid in Ontario. And all of those lunches are going to be made up with 100% Ontario-grown produce, so that we are supporting our own agriculture in this program, especially in the face of tariffs and stuff like that, where the U.S. that heavily subsidizes their agriculture can kind of flood our market with grains, corn, etc. We want to make sure that we are providing food for our kids from our community. And then outside of that, we'd also talk about universities. Many colleges and universities are about to close. We have some declaring bankruptcy. We have programs closing left, right, and center. And it's because during the Liberals under Wynne and McGuinty, tuition had started to skyrocket. And so the Liberals stepped in and said, you have to cut tuition, but we're not going to fund you more. And so they started to grow into debt. And then when Doug Ford got elected, he cut tuition by another 10% and he froze all funding to universities and colleges. He said, you can make up your funding with international students. I don't know if you know this, but international students pay on average a minimum of $20,000 a head for their senior education. So what ended up happening is from 2017 to 2021, the number of international students in Ontario increased by 82%. In 2024, there were 435,000 international student visas given. 40% of them were just in Ontario. So it basically, and Doug Ford actually hired, or his government hired, recruitment agencies to go to other countries and specifically recruit students to go to Ontario schools. And we know from internal documents that were brought out from Freedom of Information requests that they went disproportionately to India. And on top of that, the government had little to no oversight whatsoever in what these recruitment agencies were doing. And because of that, we ran into the problems where we had international students that were living on the street in Toronto, had international students that were living 10, 20 to a basement. And then the federal government stepped in, said we're going to limit the number of student visas now. Now that that's happened, we have all these programs closing. Some professors aren't being paid. It's just gutted one of the best education systems in the world by using just a bankroll from international students and not funding it properly. So we do need to actually start investing in schools. The NDP does not support increase in tuition. So that means that the funding is going to have to come from our end.
I definitely see that. And I hear that. I'm in a class where there's about 30 of us, and almost maybe over 25 of my fellow students are international students. And they talk about what they were promised, what they believed Canada would be like when they went and were recruited by these agencies. And Canada fails them on that right now.
Absolutely. Well, there was some reports saying that these recruitment agencies were telling international students that coming here and going to school was a path to citizenship. And that's just not true. So after they're done with student visa, they either can be deported or they have to enter into our workforce and apply for a work visa. And that means that we have international, some of these satellite schools in Toronto that popped up had like 85, 90+% international students. And those students, when they're done school, ended up having to just go take a job at like Tim Hortons in Stratford or Listowel because it's where they could find full-time employment so they weren't deported. And it's just caused this massive problem. And it was all based on these fake promises made by the provincial government saying that this was going to be how they could become citizens.
You went into colleges, because I was going to bring that up because I'm seeing that every day. You started bringing this up because it's everywhere right now, but we've got lots of businesses. Agriculture is huge in this area. We've got the looming threat of US tariffs. We've got all that just hanging over us right now, and it's going to hit at federal, provincial, and even the municipalities will have to deal with it if it comes in. How are you at the Ontario level? How are you going to be standing up for us when it comes to this?
Yeah. So right off the bat, the NDP is a strong believer in like the Team Canada plan, so that whoever becomes premier and whoever forms government should be working with all other levels of government, all other parties when it comes to dealing with the threat of tariffs. It is not the job of the Premier of Ontario to be going to the US alone and dealing directly with Trump or Musk or any of them. It's not their job, and it makes us look pretty weak if we have someone going rogue and not taking part in the team effort. So a couple of things we have planned for that. Number one is, like I said, the school lunch program is going to all rely on Ontario-grown agriculture. After that, we're also looking at any government builds or government funded or government owned builds or developments that are going to be done. We'll be using Ontario aluminum, steel, timber. We're not going to be sourcing it from brands. We're also going to have to look at removing interprovincial trade barriers so that we can start breaking out into trade into other provinces, and also looking at other avenues internationally through other provinces. Another thing we need to look at is we need to look at processing more of our agriculture in Ontario. Right now, a lot of like the pork, for example, we're one of the major growers of pork, and a lot of that pork has to then be shipped to the US for processing and then shipped back to Canada to hit the shelf. So it might have the maple leaf on it saying this is a Canadian product, but it had to go to the US and back. So if we're talking about tariffs and retaliatory tariffs, at that point, we could be talking about a 50% price increase just on tariffs alone because we aren't able to process in country. So that's a huge problem. Another thing we'd like to do is create a provincial and federal joint program that would offer similar payments to what happened during COVID if your job was removed or if you have some income lost due to tariffs. Another thing that's exciting that we're looking at for small businesses in particular is that if you have a small business, like remember, small businesses in Ontario can be fairly large, right? Like they don't even hit the second tax rate until we're talking at $500,000 annual income. So small businesses can be fairly large, but they can also be put at threat by these tariffs. So what we'd like to do with that is offer ways for employees to actually make trusts. Yeah, so the employees can actually put wealth into a trust to help take some of the ownership of the small business in order to keep it afloat during tough times. And then the Buy Ontario program is just going to be the provincial government, the NDP, making a bunch of different tools and funding and advertising that is specifically directed around buying Ontario products.
And then you brought it up earlier. You didn't bring it up in a positive light, and that doesn't bother me because I don't think too positively about it. Roads and infrastructure, projects like Highway 413, the tunnel under the 401 or whatever, that's just nuts. These projects, and I'll lump it in with protecting our green belt and building houses there like Ford's tried to do. And how is the NDP going to work on all these things or not work? Would you put an end to some of these
Yeah.
ideas?
So there's quite a few of Ford's ideas we're going to put an end to. Right off the bat, we're going to cancel the new science center and repair the old one because it's been shown that it's going to cost us like 1.4 billion extra to build the new one. And as it turns out, the reason he wanted to build the new one is because it was going to extend the line to the new facility and it would increase the property values of the land speculators that own land near where they were going to build the new facility. Just like Highway 413, which a third-party analysis showed was only going to save drivers 30 seconds. However, it was going to increase the property values of land speculators that own land where it was going to be built. And those land speculators were people that were all at his daughter's wedding, where a cash gift was recommended. So it's the same people. Just like we're not going to be developing the Greenbelt, we're going to make sure that's protected. We're also going to expand on protections like that. We're going to return the land to the people of Wilmot, to the farmers of Wilmot that was expropriated from them as well. There's a lot of, like, to be honest, Doug Ford has added almost $100 billion to our provincial debt, right, in his term, in 7 years. That's almost that's $10 billion a year in debt that he's added. Our provincial debt is only around 430 billion. So he's at 20% of our entire debt has his name on it. And you got to think that's crazy when we haven't funded education, healthcare, or any of the services we rely on.
Mm-hmm.
We also, as far as investments in infrastructure and all that, we want to do a lot more investments in public transportation. So what we're going to do with that is we're going to actually upvote 50% of the cost of public transportation from municipalities to the province. So things like municipal public busing and intercity busing, like the Go Connect system and all that, those would now be 50% paid for by the province, removing some of that burden on the municipalities, which hopefully makes it more feasible for them to keep these services operating. Another thing we're looking to do is return the rebate on electric vehicles. However, we will not offer a rebate on any Teslas. Sorry, no. If we threaten our sovereignty and our income, you're not getting a rebate. Another thing we were going to do to save some money is cancel Elon Musk's satellite internet contract. That contract, like, even if we're not talking about the fact that Elon Musk is who he is and doing what he's doing, Starlink only costs, the base services with Dish cost like $300 a person or $300 a household. The most expensive one, which can be mounted on a moving vehicle and keep connection at 120 kilometers an hour, is $2,500. The deal with the Ford government made with Musk is for $6,600 per person. Okay. It's almost 300% more than the most expensive plan you could possibly buy. And it's covering a region that, according to their own website, is already covered. So I don't know why we're spending $100 million on it. If I had to guess, I'd say we're buying influence from someone that we know likes to meddle in international elections. Yeah, we're going to cancel that hard. I don't care that the tariffs were postponed a month. Canceling that contract, it was bad to begin with.
I don't even know what to say about that, like going ahead with that after all this started, especially when you see Starlink being used as a threat. He'll turn it on and turn it off in certain regions like Ukraine when they do something that he didn't agree with. Musk just threatened to turn it off, and he did at one point. So that's not this sort of thing that gives me security as a resident of Ontario right now, that we'd be putting some of our the connection for some of our citizens into hands that might see it as a way to move things along politically, or
Oh,
as you start,
absolutely.
yeah.
He consistently does it with many, many companies, right? Like there are people that are saying right now on what is now referred to as X, formerly Twitter. People are just being added to follow Donald Trump without ever doing it, right? They're just the program itself is doing it. Or there's reports out there people who follow like Alexandria Ortega Cortez and other more leftist officials who are just having their accounts unfollow them without them taking part in it whatsoever, right? Like we know that Elon Musk is a petty person
Mhm.
and he is more than willing to use his abilities to his positions to try and win influence. And so, yeah, making contracts with someone that we know is doing that is never a good idea.
No.
Like, no matter how you think, how friendly you feel they are at that point, that can change. And we should be making $100 million investments that are supposed to be for generations to be dealing with.
Mhm.
Especially since we have a telesat company like called Telesat, a satellite communications company in Canada. That's
Mhm.
Canadian.
Yep.
To just be investing in them.
This goes along with the green belt, and it goes along with everything. And it seems to me, especially with the way the US is going, that we have to kind of fight to have things like climate change still be recognized in our policies and all that, because the movement is, if we start following what they're doing, which I'm not saying we are yet, but if we do, climate change is something. How are you going to keep that as a high issue?
Yeah. So I actually spoke a lot about this in my closing statements at the All Canada event in the local. And what I basically said is like it was fairly direct there. Like they had different tables set up where them as a community, they decided what those topics were going to be. And the
Okay.
topics were housing, affordability, education, and healthcare.
Mhm.
And I pointed out to them, like, these are all the basic necessities you need for life, right? If you don't have access to housing, you die. If you don't have access to food, you'll die. If you don't have access to proper healthcare, you'll die. You won't die without education, but society will within a couple of generations. And I said, like, this shouldn't be what we're having conversations about at election time. We shouldn't be in such bad condition that we're talking about the required basic necessities of life. And the argument that like this entire election is about dealing with Trump. No, I hate reactionary politics. I cannot stand reactionary politics. It was the worst during the pandemic, dealing with constant reactionary stuff and nothing ever being proactive or nothing ever being outside of just that. So right now we have two schools of thought going into this election. We're talking about the basics required to live, because that's apparently a political issue now, and reacting towards the election of a president in the South. But it used to not be like that. Like I remember the last election we had, one of the biggest or one election or two elections ago, one of the biggest points that people were talking about was the opiate epidemic,
Yep.
right? It was climate change. We were talking about how to make things better, not how to not die. And so what we just need to do is we need to have governments in office that are able to make sure that the basic necessities of life aren't a concern, so that when we have elections, we can actually talk about things like climate change and addiction and improving society, not just not letting society die.
I really like that. That's because you're spot on in that. And because those last few elections, I was working. And I mean, there's other things we haven't even been touching on this election much, which they won't have to kill DEI, because we won't have enough time for talking about those issues while we're panicking about the basic necessities. So, yeah, because those other elections, we talked about so many other things. And like LGBT communities were a bigger issue, like something that was brought up, and all kinds of things like that. And this election, it's been panic.
Yep, that's it. Yep. We've gotten so bad that we're no longer even able to have those silly little arguments about ideologically whether or not someone else should be able to exist. You know?
Yeah.
We used to be able to have arguments about that. I'm glad that that's not an argument we're having, but it's
Yeah.
terrible. The reason why we're not having that argument is because people are just too poor to live.
Yeah. Yeah. That's some people are still making sure that argument comes up. But
Yeah. Those people also didn't have a hope and chance of getting elected.
that's
They were
true.
there to have their moment of being able to yell about that.
Yeah. Public transportation is something you brought up, and you were talking about how there was a plan in there to fund it. And like here, I'm very concerned living in Listowel. I know that PC Connect helped a lot of people in the north end of the county get to important meetings, get to friends, whatever in Stratford, just to get there to shop, even. What was the plan to save things like that?
Yeah. So 50% of the cost of those services will now be paid by the province. So
That's
that way, the municipalities were being responsible for almost all of public transportation in the past, with the exception of, well, not many that are actually in our region, right? If we get into like Toronto and other places like that, then we talk about other forms of transportation that aren't just on the municipality. But here, it was almost all on the municipality. So we're going to upvote that to the province, 50%. We're also looking at having the province start caring for more of the cost of highway maintenance in rural roads, because like our municipalities are being drained, and then they're having to increase property taxes to, because like municipalities, they have, this is how much we're allowed to go into debt. This is how much we normally get. And then the government says, well, you're getting 20% less from us. So their options are, we either have to increase property taxes 20%, or we have to increase them below 20% and cut something in the middle. And Doug Ford is perfectly fine with municipalities having to have that conversation, because that means you're mad at your municipality. You're not mad at the provincial government, because they're the people that actually raised your top taxes by not funding municipalities properly, by not investing in the needs of the municipality when it comes to things like public transportation and housing and healthcare and everything else.
and healthcare, it's quite bad how much has been downloaded now to municipalities, like the municipalities the size of North Perth having to invest in their own healthcare, or smaller municipalities. And it is something I think that the province should be stepping up and
Absolutely. Absolutely.
putting in their fair share. I didn't get you to say who you are and sell yourself. And I know there's not a lot of time left to get a vote in, but can you tell people where to vote?
Absolutely. But before we do that, I do have one topic I'd like to talk about,
Okay, perfect.
and that is Bill 7. I'm not sure if you're aware what Bill 7 is. So it was
Not off the
passed
top.
under board. What Bill 7 is it basically says that when a senior goes to the hospital, if the doctors deem it is unsafe for that senior to go home, they can say you are no longer allowed to go home. You have to go to a long-term care facility, and they get to choose which facility you go to. You do not get to have input in it. That facility, there is no guarantee will be anywhere near where you are. So you could imagine being married for 40 years and your partner slips and falls at the grocery store and is taken to the hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And the doctor at the hospital says, I don't believe that you can go home and care for yourself because of slip and fall, and you don't have the resources necessary at home. I'm going to send you to a long-term care facility. But they send you to one 200 kilometers away. Now, this couple that's been together for 40 years are 200 kilometers apart from each other. Could you imagine if they don't drive? And they have zero recourse to stop it. If you refuse and you stay in the hospital, you will be charged a fairly large amount of cash every single day. There was one woman who was charged, I believe, $27,000 because she refused to go to a long-term care facility. She was charged $27,000 from the government for doing it. Absolutely ridiculous. It is unconstitutional and not right whatsoever. And the NDP wants to repeal that bill immediately. When basic necessities aren't being provided and like people are dying and starving and not able to be housed, it's hard to have the conversations about these other things. But this is one of those other things we really need to be talking about.
I was going to go into it earlier when I was bringing up the harm reduction earlier. The unhoused population that has sprung up over the years and the affordability crisis we're in, and we're having record numbers of people going to food banks. What are you going to do about all these things?
I don't know if you know much about my personal background, but I've been
No.
a housing advocate for the last many, many years. I co-founded Stratford Affordable Housing Alliance. I'm the director of Mickinock Community Land Trust. I have gone to every, like, even all the way to Toronto. I stayed in a hostel, went to a 3-day event in Toronto about housing. I have gone to everything that you can go to, speak to every person you can speak to about affordability and housing for years now. This is like, that is my number one passion, is building affordable housing, because like I fix transport trucks for a living. I also own a comic store. I make like $100,000 a year. I can't afford any house to purchase,
Mhm.
right? I can't. What happens to everyone else? It's ridiculous. So what we want to do with that is we want to do the Homes Ontario. So what Homes Ontario would be, it would be a new government agency which is tasked with dealing with housing. Up until 1993, the number one builder of homes in this country was the federal government. They built 10% of all homes in this country, and that's how we didn't have these housing problems. In 1993, the federal Liberals handed it down to the provinces. By the time the provinces got the paperwork, it was Mike Harris, and he was like, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm busy trying to destroy education. I can't build homes." And so for 30 years, we've had liberal and conservative governments that just haven't done anything. Like, it's insane. The last time there was any government agency in charge of building homes for Ontario was the year the Backstreet Boys formed. Not got famous, formed. Like, that's why we have a problem. Like, everyone's saying, oh, we just need to build more housing. I did a 22-minute statistical analysis of the housing market to Stratford City Council. I could send you a link to it. We don't actually have a shortage of housing. We have 1.4 million vacant homes in this country, or 1.3 million, and over 400,000 of them alone are in Ontario. Doug Ford increased the number of housing starts in like 2018 to 2022 from 67,500, which was the previous median, to 100,000. And yet in that same time, the cost of housing for purchase went up by 202%. Since 2018, the rental market has gone up by 93.6%. Building more isn't solving the problem because we're not building enough housing. So having the Homes Ontario plan, that way there we can direct to make sure we're building the right kind of thing. We can work with nonprofits and municipalities to build the right kind of housing. We don't need more $800,000 mansions. We need to build homes in the $250,000 to $350,000, $400,000 price range. We also need to build the missing middle, which is like apartments that can actually, not sky rises that can't fit more than a couple and a dog, but mid-rise apartments that can actually have a 3-bedroom with a child, or a 2-bedroom, two adults and a child, one that can actually have a growing family for an extended period of time. Yeah, I have developers that can get you a $1,200 or 1,200 square foot poured concrete move-in ready home for $250,000. We have a developer out of Stratford that's currently building over 1,000 homes in Waterloo with Habitat for Humanity that are move-in ready at $350,000. It is possible to build these affordable homes. It's just that we don't have a government willing to do it. So it's instead municipalities, nonprofits, and developers that are just like, well, someone has to eventually, that are building the nonprofit or the affordable housing, and it's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous.
It's scary for like I have a couple kids living here still that are just into their, well, almost through their 20s because they haven't been able to move on like they've wanted to because it was just astronomically expensive for them. One of
Yep.
them has to commute from Listowel to one of the college campuses in Mississauga because
Um,
nothing was available, really,
yeah.
except
Yeah,
for,
it's the worst is like we can't even pretend like we have a government that's even trying to address this because the
mhm.
government we have removed rent control, right? Like they are very clearly more interested in benefiting from this crisis being a way to remove regulations and protections for our environment and ways for municipalities to have a say in what is being built so that they can just continue to make more and more money with these land speculators and developers. That's it. They benefit from this being inexpensive. And that's not even starting to talk about how many MPs and MPPs themselves are landlords.
Yeah, I've I've got nothing to say to that because that's just a bit of truth you just spoke. It's anyways, you still haven't said your name and tried to sell yourself and let
Let me tell you a little bit about me. All right, so my name is Jason Davis. I am the Ontario NDP MPP candidate for Perth-Wellington. I have been a diesel technician in this region for the last 12 years, fixing farm equipment and transport trucks. I also operate Stratford Comic Stop, which is mostly online, but I also do local venue shows where I give out free books to kids and stuff like that. Because we live in a day and age where just having one job isn't always enough, rent and groceries. Outside of that, I have a wife and a toddler who I love very much. And one of the main things that we're running on is, or that I'm running for, is the fact that like it's difficult to see a future here anymore for my family, let alone for my son. Right? Like we've allowed everything to be commodified, and then it invested in brought to such a extent where basic necessities are these things we're talking about, right? Like we didn't even talk about groceries and what the NDP's plan for groceries is. I'm actually really excited about that one. Like, yes, we have the grocery rebate, which is up to $120 a month. This is a temporary rebate for low income and middle class families just until wages can keep up with inflation or until the threat of tariffs is gone. But what's really exciting is that we want to, right off the bat, tell all major grocers you now have to label when you increase prices by more than 2%. Just like when you put prices down on sale, you have to now label. No more of this, we're going to increase the price $2. We're going to put it at 30% off of that and call it a sale. But meanwhile, it's actually more than it was a week before. And when that sale ends, we actually put a 40% increase on it. Like grocery prices have inflated well beyond actual inflation year over year. And they say that they can't help it because if this and that and this and that, the economy, whatever. But we look, and every time they have a quarterly report out, they're making more money than they have ever made before, right? And that's the most exciting thing about groceries is we're going to be installing a watchdog. And what this person does is it is a government hire that's only purpose is to make sure that enforcement laws are being implemented so that we can't have price fixing in the grocery stores anymore. We know they do it. They did it with bread. It's very obvious they're doing it with other things. I would love to see the government step in and say like, hey, no more of these oligopolies in oligarchies in the grocery chains. You are going to actually have capitalism, or we are going to start fining you.
in there you said you used a line that quite often I hear from the right wing. You said about you don't feel that, oh, I can't remember it exactly. You don't feel that your life is, they always say it because they feel that, DEI is coming to take their way of life. But you said the same line in there. It was you don't know kind of about, you're unsure about your future. And
Yeah.
but but it was for reasons I could relate to. I can't relate when someone like who's fairly well off is like I'm afraid of the future because people want me to treat other people with respect. I can't relate to that,
Well,
but the
for a
way you
long
put
time,
it,
we've always tried to find scapegoats for things, right?
mhm,
And it's time that we stop that. Like, we don't need to blame the minorities or people based on age groups or gender or sexuality or any of that. Like, they aren't hurting you. They aren't affecting your life in any way. But we do know who is, and it's about time we start actually doing something about it, right? Not just using the fact that we're in a bad time to try and gain political points, because that seems to be something especially the Conservatives excel at. We will be bad at our jobs governing you so that your life gets worse, and then we will point at that group and say, they're the reason your life sucks. And it's not the fact that we haven't done a good job for the last 7 years.
It's been really great to chat with you and learn about where you're coming from in the NDP. I know it was such a quick election.
It was as short as it legally was allowed to be.
Yeah, and that was
could
on
not legally be short. Yeah.
Where can people still vote?
Yeah, so for Perth-Wellington, you can go to 107 Erie Street, which is the parking lot behind the features in Stratford. It's at the back of the Stratford Hotel. You can go there all the way up until February 26th. It's open from Monday at 10 a.m. till Monday to Saturday, 10 a.m. to 8 p.m., Sunday 12 to 5. And then on voting day, which is the 27th, you would have to go to your registered polling station. If you do not receive a voter information card, you do not need one. You just need photo ID with your address, or if you've recently moved, photo ID in combination with a bill that has your new address on it, such as a hydro bill. If you're unsure where to go, you can go to elections.on.ca, and then you can go from there to find out by postal code what your actual polling station will be. Or you can just drive to the nearest one you remember. If that's not where you're meant to vote, they will tell you the right place to go to. But also, if anyone has any issues with getting to a polling place, you can email me at jason.davis@ontariondp.ca, and we will help get you a ride there. Also, you can call elections, or the 107 Erie spot, the Elections Ontario location, and talk to them. They also are arranging for people to get rides to polling locations, and I believe there might still be time for people to vote from in their homes too if you have mobility issues. But yeah, no matter what, people need to vote. I think, 44% voted last election? Only 18% of them voted for Ford, and he won a majority government. We can't have that happen.
Again, thank you for taking the time out to chat with me, and it was really nice to meet you.
You'll never change the world, you say. And yes, that would be true. If all we had to call upon were people just like you, who haven't got the stomach and who haven't got the heart, who slaver when their bell rings, who are beaten from the start. But thankfully there's thousands who haven't given in, who'll never be defeated even if they never win, who stand up when it matters and who'll shout out now with pride. Yes, maybe we won't change the world, but at least we fucking tried.
Thanks for listening. Thanks again to Jason for the interview. I ended the show with the poem You'll Never Change the World by Joe Solo. Check the description for more information about how to find more music by Joe. Visit Wood-stein.ca, that's WOOD-STEIN.ca. You can support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/Colin Burrows. There are bonus videos and more for people who support through Patreon. Like, share, comment, follow, and support Wood-stein Media and this podcast, and have a wonderful day.